Welcome back. You're watching RT International. Now, deepening divides between the UK and its Muslim population have been revealed in a major new poll. The former head of the Equality and Human Rights Commission said the results showed integrating Muslims could become, quote, the hardest task that society has ever faced.
The data collected shows a chasm opening between Muslims and non-Muslims, and the chasm isn't going to disappear anytime soon. What it reveals is the unacknowledged creation of a nation within the nation, with its own geography, its own values, and its own very separate future.
And now to discuss this, I'm joined live by Mohammed Ansar, political and social commentator, and Neil Wallace, media commentator. Thank you so much for joining me, both Neil and Mo, to discuss this very interesting and controversial issue at the same time. So let's now take a closer look into the survey. So the new data, as we now just see in the graphics here on the screens, shows that 2 in 5 Muslims believe a woman should always obey her husband. It also says that 1 in 3 British Muslims support the right of a man to have more than one wife. And finally, a quarter of the interviewees said that in some areas of Britain, Sharia law should be introduced. Now, based on these numbers, how fair is the claim that there is now, quote, nation within a nation in the UK? Let's start with Mohammed.
I think this is quite a troubling survey. I think it's troubling because anybody would look at the headline results and think that Muslims are a nation within a nation. They would think that Muslims are somehow the other, that their views are alien and foreign to ideas of democracy and liberalism and a pluralist society. And I think once you scratch the surface, we begin to look at who Trevor Phillips is and why is he peddling this kind of othering of Muslims when he has been so much a staunch supporter of multiculturalism and plurality in society. Since having left the Equality and Human Rights Commission, he's more or less said multiculturalism is broken and has taken a very hard-line neoconservative view against Muslims. I think also when we look at ICM, 10 years ago they released a poll after the 7/7 bombings which said something like 40% of Muslims supported the jihadis and the 7/7 bombers, which was later shown to be less than 1%. So I think the headline rates are there to scare people, to other Muslims, to sort of provide column inches for Trevor and for the television programme which he's trying to put out on Wednesday. But in reality, I think we'll find Muslims support a tolerant, pluralist, democratic British society. But if you go into any inner city areas and you target underprivileged, disenfranchised, poorly educated and unenlightened people of all faiths and beliefs, you'll find a similar sort of thing.
Well, certainly. We'll explore this in more detail a little later. Let's now turn to Neil. Neil, what do you make of this survey, and do you think it may stir up anti-Muslim sentiments and lead to further social tensions?
I don't think either of those things. I thought that what Mo said there is actually rather well encapsulated within the article. To suggest that Trevor Phillips, for instance, is some sort of neocon is laughable. He's a well-known member of the Labour Party. His thrust in this piece is that he was the man who coined the phrase Islamophobia and warned about the dangers of it 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The problem was that the solution, which was multiculturalism, which was effectively ghettoisation in Britain, the belief that it was perfectly fine for the Muslim community and the white community to live completely separate lives, has proved to be a disaster. And that's what these figures show. And there's much more to this article than these statistics. And don't forget, this survey was conducted face-to-face in the homes of Muslims, talking to Muslims, both men and women. And what becomes very clear is that there is an issue. Now, I don't think it's helped by scarifying it. I think what matters and what really Trevor Phillips is trying to say here is we need to address the issue. And the issue is primarily this, that Muslims like living here, that, however, Muslims like living here on their terms. And that's the issue. There is no sign that they wish to blend into the traditional, if you like, the British melting pot.
Okay, now, Mo, do you agree or disagree with what Neil just said? I mean, he said basically that Muslims like living in the UK on their turf. To what extent do you agree or disagree with the statement?
I think some of what Neil says is fair. I think just to nip something in the bud, I think to say that there are no neoconservatives in the Labour Party is ridiculous when you look at the likes of Tony Blair. But that is
we're just talking about Muslims. Mo, I'd like you to focus on the statement that Neil just said, that Muslims like living in the UK on their own turf, on their own terms.
Yeah, I think there are a range of different surveys which we need to look at, because I think a couple of years ago there was a survey from Professor Linda Woodhead as part of work she's done with Charles Clarke in the Westminster Faith Debate, and she found that somewhere like when you look at LGBT issues, and so some of these things are used as tests on whether communities are lending themselves to Western, British, European, liberal democratic values. She found that actually people from different faith communities, like certain white English Christian communities, have certain harder views on issues like homosexuality and opposition to same-sex marriage. There was a Gallup poll which said that Muslims have a far better nuanced view on freedom of expression. I think the University of Essex said that something like 83% of Muslims are proud British citizens, compared to 79% of the British population. And in fact, interesting enough, when Neil's talking about these blended communities, 82% of Muslims said that they wanted to live in diverse mixed communities, compared to just over 60% of the indigenous British population. So Muslims want to live in want to live in multicultural societies, and I think are largely supportive of liberal
Nobody
system.
can argue with that. I mean, we all want to live in a harmonious society, etc. But the question here is about what we contribute to harmony and respect of different ethnic groups. And the question here is, I mean, of course, multiculturalism is a big issue in Europe, but many are blaming Muslim communities for not contributing enough to, bridging that gap that exists there between Muslims and other ethnic groups. So are Muslims doing enough?
I think that's a really important question you raised. Demos did some research which came out at the end of last year, which I wrote about on an article, The Muslim Penalty, which said that the Muslim community, certainly in Britain, and I think this can be extended when you look at the lessons of Molenbeek and you can look at the other lessons throughout Europe, Muslims are the most excluded and discriminated against class of population in the workplace. Now, if you have, in Britain, for example, you've got 80% of British Muslims on or below the poverty line, 88% of British Bangladeshi communities were affected by the removal of education maintenance allowance, and now we've put degrees up to £53,500 for a degree. So if you exclude Muslims from the workplace, if you discriminate against them and you create a disenfranchised, marginalised community, Martin Luther King talked about in the 60s creating a black middle class which would help to address issues of civil rights and civil society.
Well, let's just for a second turn to Neil. Neil.
Here you have a microcosm of the problem. What you've just heard there is an endless, soft-left, liberal, self-serving litany of constant excuses. This reason, that reason. We have, what this survey shows, and what is really interesting is, I suspect Mo has only seen the same as I have. There will be much more of this comes out in the Wednesday night's programme. But what you see is that the community does not want to integrate. That is what comes through. It does not want... Now, you can argue that they're fully entitled to do that, but what you can't do is pretend that it isn't an issue. What these figures show...
Neil, will you agree that the community polled... Will you agree the community polled won't integrate, as opposed to Muslims across the UK? Would you agree that the community polled of that sample of those people...
Well, you can keep shouting at me, Mo.
At this point, Neil and Mohammed, I'd like to interrupt you and just thank you for this discussion, because it's a fascinating topic to talk about. Certainly, as Neil rightly put it, more will be coming out in the near future. Unfortunately, we are indeed running out of time, so I have to thank you both for interrupting. We'll continue talking about it, I'm sure, in the program here. Talking to me right now was Mohammed Ansar, political and social commentator, and Neil Wallace, media commentator. Thanks so much, both of you, for your thoughts.
Thank you.
And next on RT International, Afshin Natansi discusses suicide detention camps and going underground. And if you're watching us in the UK or Ireland, Pakistan's former Prime Minister tells Sophie & Co. about the country's problems with extremism. Just stay with us.